Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cubase 5. This is Dave from ATC Memes. You may have seen the first video where I made a sort of behind-the-scenes look at the digital audio workstation like this. On this particular one, though, I'm not going to post it to the main site. I'm going to sort of just keep it to my personal YouTube, but make it public, so if people want to share it, they're more than welcome to do that. I mean, I'm not going to tell them, you can't share this stuff. And I'm not ashamed to say that, this is one big troll. You know, it's been fun, but in the heart of all this stuff is just my quest and my love for making audio come to life. That is really why I do this stuff. You know, I'm not there to confuse people or start controversy, although it sort of did. But to me, that just means we're doing our job really well. I'm here to manipulate audio, trying to make it sound real. You know, we're trying to transcend our own view of reality for a little bit, just to take us out of what we know as being the truth and take us into these fantasy worlds that you couldn't do without the expression that we get on these audio platforms. So welcome to my world, okay? Now, I'm just going to go through basically how we did this. A lot of people have actually, they haven't even asked. You know, it's funny. A lot of times they ask us, you know, how did you make that? What did you do to make that sound realistic? And in this one, there was very few of those questions. It was more like, how did you get the audio from that plane? I actually had a guy, actually two people, but one in particular, he sent me a audio message asking if he could interview the person, this is a true story, if he could interview the person that recorded the audio of the captain's PA announcement on the JetBlue flight. I'm like, really? So that's when you know you're doing something right. So let's talk about how we did this. Basically, I had woken up in the morning and I was watching our site, seeing that we had 14,000 shares of that meme stating that the Christmas lights on the wings are, well, in fact, Christmas lights. They're red and green. Of course, we all know that's fake. So first of all, if you believe that, you have bigger problems than believing a falsified audio recording. But I digress. So the point is, I thought it'd be really funny to take that to the whole next level and say, not only did people believe it, but they actually asked the pilot to do it, and it just came together beautifully. So let's talk about how we made this. First of all, this is Cubase 5, like I mentioned before. I have another video if you don't understand what that means, but essentially it's just a digital audio workstation. We have tracks 1, 2, 3, and this little guy is 4, which is the seatbelt dinger, which is a critical part of this scenario. Essentially what these are is, I did name them. I try and keep organized here. I'll close these guys. So cabin ambience, which is just the sound of the aircraft and its passengers doing whatever they do. This is the 400 hertz tail. It's essentially a 400 hertz file that just plays the, well, almost like AC bleed into the system of the plane.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of
That's what all that does. Down here is the main. This is the captain's actual announcement, which you can see has more of an organic look to it. That's because it's voice. That's my voice speaking. And of course, down here, like I said, we have the seatbelt thing. All right, putting these all together, it's very simple, very simple scenario. So I'm going to play it just up into the seatbelt thing, so you can sort of get an idea of all the stuff working together here.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of JetBlue Airlines, welcome aboard flight 1403 with service down to San Juan, Puerto Rico this morning. Weather down there in San Juan showing 81 degrees, mostly clear skies, light winds out of the south at 5 miles an hour. Computers showing a flight time of 3 hours and 12 minutes. We're planned at 35,000 feet today. Shouldn't expect too many bumps, but you never know. So if you're in your seats, please keep your seatbelts fastened. Bill, it's my obligation on behalf of...
All right, so you got the idea. A lot of this has to do, in this particular scenario, has to do with reverberation. And that's what this is up here. It's a convolution reverb. I'm going to close out the Kramer tapes and stuff for a second. But this is a convolution reverb right here, this thing. Now, what a convolution reverb does is it essentially takes what the audio guys would call a profile of a room. Or it doesn't have to be a room. It could be like a reverb plate. It could be a spring. It could be like a car. It could even be a radio or anything. Anything that you can have process a sound, which in theory could be an infinite number of things, can have a profile extracted and then saved as a convolution type thing. And you can re-inject any other signal to it and then have it being reproduced. In other words, if I sample, so to speak, the cabin of a plane, I can then inject any signal into that profile and it will sound like it's coming from the cabin of a plane. So what I did is I sort of made my own. I thought, okay, this sounds a little bit like you might think a inside of an Airbus would sound like, I guess. If I solo this track, you'll hear that.
Staff of JetBlue Airlines, welcome aboard Flight 1403 with service down to San Juan, Puerto Rico this morning.
Now, this is the dry and the wet slider. For those of you who don't know or you're not familiar with audio, basically dry and wet describes how much of the signal is being actively processed. So, in other words, if it was 100% wet, like it was before, all of the signal is coming through the processor, in this case, the reverb. If it's 0 or to 100% dry, then it means none of the signal is coming through the processor, and all of it is being what we would call bypassed. So the reason why this is such a hugely helpful parameter is because a lot of times you don't want 100% reverb. I mean, it would sound horrible. Think of a singer, a vocal singer, going into a reverb plate. I mean, it could even be like one of those, like, old AMS digital reverbs or like a Lexicon PCM70. They're very, very dense. They're very rich. And if you were to add them all to the 100%, what you end up getting is this like wash of shit. It just sounds really bad because all the reverbs are sort of like fighting each other. So typically, and again, very typically, I use that word sparingly, but we would keep the dry wetness around 20 to 40%. You normally wouldn't have it cranked up to 100 because, like I said, it's going to be fighting with other tracks. Of course, we're not making music in this particular case. We're making an environment. So you actually want it to be 100%. What I'll do is I'll bring it down to 0% and then crank it up to 100 so you can see what this thing actually does.
Weather down there in San Juan showing 81 degrees, mostly clear skies, light winds out of the south at 5 miles an hour. Computer showing a flight time of 3 hours and 12 minutes. We're planned at 35,000 feet today. Shouldn't expect too many bumps, but you never know. So
you hear that difference? It's pretty incredible, right?
So if you're in your seats, please keep your seatbelts fastened. I feel it's my obligation on behalf of JetBlue to mention something to you. We've had multiple passengers ask if we could replace the light bulb.
Okay, now that basically is the environmental reverb, and like I said, I kind of designed this old, my own profile to be based on an Airbus cabin. When you think of an airplane, there's really no right angles. Right angles create standing waves. I'm not going to get really geeky about this, but essentially those are the flashback flip-flop type waves where it sounds really, it's really going to slam you with echo and reverb. The less amount of angles you have, the less reverb you typically have. Plus, think of an airplane that's full of people, it's full of luggage, it's full of coats and jackets and seats, so there's not a lot of reverb. In fact, that's why it almost sounds sort of like tight. So I took the resonation, which is the reverb parameter, all the way down to 0.25. And admittedly, I have no idea what that number means. It's some sort of dimensionless number that I don't really care about, but it's the lowest that this processor will go. And the size, likewise, I brought it all the way down to 25. And also the reverb time, which is what we would call the tail of the reverb, which is this thing here, is also the lowest it will go at 0.2 seconds. So that's very low to the point of you can't even really hear a reverb. You can only feel that there's a difference in the room.
Bulbs today on the wings to accommodate requests for colors. Unfortunately, the FAA and ICAO.
Okay, so there you go. Now let's talk about some of the other processors here, if I haven't bored you enough already. I'm going to leave the reverb on, but close the processor window and open up the EQ. This is a huge part of the sound. For those of you who don't know what an EQ is, it just cuts or boosts different frequencies of the sound. So in other words, if you were looking at a sound, you can take certain aspects of the frequency and make them louder or softer. So in this case, you can see below about, 250 hertz, and below is all gone. We would call that a cut, or if you really want to be technical, you can call that a high-pass filter. These guys call it LF, which is the low filter, and the high filter. So low pass is basically the same as saying a high cut. A high filter. So it's weird because when you think about it, we're actually cutting from the left and the right. So from everything from about 250 hertz up to about, like 3,000 hertz or so, which is right about here, is alive. Everything else is cut. So what this does is it makes it sound like a little tiny shitty speaker.
They do standardize the colors that this aircraft is equipped with.
That's without the EQ, of course.
With respect to the lights, so unfortunately we will not be making those accommodations for you. We apologize for any inconvenience.
Okay, now next we have dynamics, which deals with the dynamic range compression. Basically what this does is it helps make everything one volume. A compressor is probably one of the most confusing things. I wouldn't say it's confusing, but it's the most misunderstood. Let's just put it that way. If my brother Mark is watching this, he will probably be shaking his head in huge agreement right now, because we used to talk all the time about how compression is just absolutely abused, and it's really taken a whole new meaning onto itself. But a compressor deals with dynamic range. You set a threshold, and basically what this does is it tells the compressor that anything above this threshold, measured in signal strength or decibels, anything above that is going to be lowered in volume. Now, how much the compressor lowers it in volume has to do with this, which is called ratio. In other words, if I had a ratio of 2 to 1, that means for each 2 decibels above the threshold, the compressor will ensure it only goes up 1. For each, if it was 8 to 1, for each 8 decibels above the threshold, the compressor will ensure it only goes up 1. So you can see the more ratio we have, the more it's going to compress the sound. The problem with this, though, is that it doesn't do it immediately. It waits a few milliseconds, and we can actually adjust that here, which is what's called attack. So you take the attack to like 4, 5, 6, 7 milliseconds, all the way up to like 52 milliseconds. These are what are called transients. The human mind actually interprets sound differently based on the transient attack. So if I was having a snare drum recorded and it only is, let's say, let 10 milliseconds of the loud signal come through before the compressor does its compression, it'll sound snappier than if I had 0.52 milliseconds. Because what happens is your human mind, in its inconsistencies, will hear that small 10 millisecond attack as being punchier, because what it's doing is it's attacking the sound immediately after you register it. So with all this said and done, what the compressor is actually doing is it's not really making the sound one volume, although, I mean, that's what it's doing in a technical sense, but what it's really doing is it's making the sound more punchy. That's the point of a compressor, to help things sound punchier and to help things sound more organic. By the way, hold is essentially the opposite of attack. It's, I guess we won't really talk about hold because most people would just use this release thing. Release is the opposite of attack, and it's when does the compressor release the signal and let it go back up to what it was. Typically, it's obviously longer than the attack time, but I don't know, like 100 milliseconds or something. That seems to be a normal aspect of it. This is the knee. A lot of compressors actually don't have this setting. That's called a hard knee, like the sharper one, and it's called soft knee. It's basically just how it transitions from the non-compressed to the compressed sound. I usually keep it I think it was at 15, whatever, it works. But let's hear the signal with the compressor that I've set up.
Weather down there in San Juan showing 81 degrees, mostly clear skies, light winds.
Now I'm going to bypass it so you can hear without the compressor. Now we have a linear relationship, so the compressor will no longer be compressing our signal above that threshold.
Winds out of the south at 5 miles an hour. Computer showing a flight time of 3 hours and 12 minutes. We're playing at...
You hear how it sort of loses a little bit of its balls? It doesn't sound as good.
Land at 35,000 feet today. Shouldn't expect too many bumps, but you never know. So if you're in your seats, please keep your seats.
That's a huge aspect of the sound, and also with respect to music, it's a great way to get things to gel better in the mix. Finally, we have the Kramer tape, which is a distortion simulator or emulator, pushes some distortion into it.
Keep your seatbelts fastened. I feel it's mildly on behalf of JetBlue to mention something to you. We've had multiple passengers ask if we could replace...
It's kind of cool. I'm a huge fan of analog tape. You might have seen my profile picture on Facebook, the quantity tape, 3M reel. I have a lot of these things. I have an old Revox B77, which is just like a beautiful half-inch tape machine, 15 inches per second. And if you've never heard tape, it's very, very organic. It's like it's hard to describe, but it would be like driving a vintage sports car versus driving a modern supercar. It's like it might not be as sleek and sexy, but there's something about it that is just so real, and you connect to that on a certain level. Now, granted, this is an emulator, so it's not real tape, obviously, but it does give a little bit of that vibe, and I really like the Kramer tape. I think Waves did a fantastic job with this, so kudos to them. Amazing plugin. Right now I'm going to take off all the signal, all the processors, and this is the raw signal. Replace the light bulbs today on the wings to accommodate requests for colors. Unfortunately, the FAA and ICAO do standardize the colors. There you go. That's really the raw signal, and we're going to add everything we just talked about back in.
That this aircraft is equipped with respect to the lights, so unfortunately we will not be making those accommodations for you. We apologize for any...
Now, finally, I apply the 400 hertz, which is sort of like I said, I might have mentioned it, like the AC current bleed.
For any inconvenience, and I do realize this is related to a social media post that has been circling.
And we're going to add the cabin ambience, which is actually unprocessed the way it is now. It's just the way it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of JetBlue Airlines, welcome aboard Flight 1403 with service down to San Juan, Puerto Rico this morning. Weather down there in San Juan showing 81.
Finally, this little seatbelt dinger is just mirrored image effects of the cabin announcement, which sort of makes sense because in reality that sound would be coming out of the same speaker as the announcement. So I just mirrored the effects, and this is what this sounds like.
Please keep your seatbelts fastened. Bill, it's my obligation on behalf of JetBlue to mention something to you. We've had multiple passengers ask if we could replace the
Small bits of realism. The 400 hertz cuts out when the pilot hangs up.
Flight attendants, please secure the cabin for departure. Thank you.
I'm a big stickler for details, so like I don't know if you heard that, but this is actually not right. That 400 hertz should obviously stop when the pilot stops the transmission on the PA, not before it. So
Secure the cabin for departure. Thank you.
stuff like that. Anyway, that's how we did this one, and I hope this gives you a little bit of an insight into what went into making that little thing. When all was said and done, this only took about 20 minutes, so a lot of fun, and you never know what's gonna come next. Thanks for being a fan. Thanks for watching, and hopefully somebody out there finds this and maybe they can debunk some of these myths. Because I tell you what, I know Snopes didn't properly debunk this. They thought this was real, which is absolutely hilarious to me. On behalf of ATC Memes, thanks for being a fan, and talk to you guys later.